Jamari Toles was just 10 when a Harvard professor mocked his genius on national TV, then dared him to solve a problem no student ever could. But what began as a viral math stunt turned into something darker. Because when Jamari cracked the code, the professor didn't applaud, he vanished. The cameras caught everything, except what Harvard did next. Now Jamari's brilliance isn't just rewriting equations. It's exposing a system built to erase him. And the question isn't whether he'll win, it's who's trying to silence him first. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The lecture hall pulsed with fluorescent light and hushed expectation. Tiered rows of Harvard students leaned forward in their seats, some with arms crossed, others gripping notebooks or half-closed laptops. Cameras hovered from the back of the room, one operated by a graduate student interning for a documentary project. But it was the cell phones, hundreds of them, that would ultimately capture the moment that shattered every preconceived notion in that room. At the center of it all stood Jamari Toles, 10 years old, barely tall enough to reach the middle of the whiteboard without stretching. His sneakers squeaked softly on the polished floor as he took a breath, surveying the equation sprawled before him in thick, arrogant strokes. It wasn't just numbers, it was a wall built with symbols few undergraduates could decipher, let alone reduce. Beside him, Professor Walter Dunning stood statuesque, his wire-rimmed glasses perched just below his scowl, watching in amused skepticism. The audience had already assumed the narrative. A cute, viral curiosity. A feel-good moment, perhaps staged. A boy genius giving it his best shot. But no one expected what came next. With measured calm, Jamari picked up the black marker, uncapped it, and began to rewrite the problem. Not solve it, not attack it, but reshape it. He didn't flinch, he didn't look back, and as the lines began to flow from his hand, a ripple of confusion rolled through the room, followed by a tidal wave of disbelief. The footage, less than 3 minutes long, hit Twitter within 15 minutes. Then Reddit. Then TikTok. A child, black and unshaken, not only confronting a challenge issued by one of the most notoriously unforgiving minds in mathematics, but dominating it. It wasn't just brilliance on display, it was defiance wrapped in intellect. But the context was lost on the world. What no one outside that lecture hall knew, what the tweets, retweets, and headlines failed to capture, was the air of subtle hostility that had blanketed the room before the cameras turned on. Jamari had not been welcomed. He had not been invited with warmth. His mother had not been offered a seat. She had stood in the back, barely acknowledged, while whispered questions floated around them. Is this some TikTok stunt? Why is he even here? Is this for extra credit? The glances were coded, but familiar. The smiles were performative, stretched too thin. One student even smirked when Jamari approached the whiteboard, as if a child from the south side of Chicago could ever belong here, in the sanctum of American elitism. But then he did the unthinkable. Line by line he rewrote the problem in simpler form, reducing nested variables like peeling layers off a rotten onion. What Professor Dunning had spent years constructing his academic fortress was being dismantled by a boy barely out of elementary school. Each symbol erased and redrawn was a nail in the coffin of everything the professor represented: academic gatekeeping, racial elitism, and a system built to keep boys like Jamari out. The video froze on the moment he stepped away from the board, capped the marker, and turned. His expression wasn't smug or seeking approval. It was calm, controlled, eyes scanning the room, not for applause, but confirmation that he had not imagined what just occurred. That brilliance, when real, can make a room go silent, not in awe but in fear. The internet turned him into a phenomenon, but while most celebrated Jamari as a prodigy, the comment sections told a different story. Beneath every repost were hundreds, sometimes thousands of reactions drenched in coded racism. This has to be fake. No way he did that on his own. Probably memorized it like a trick. Where's the real footage? Others weren't subtle at all. Slurs disguised as usernames, accusations that his presence was political. The same pattern, over and over. Deny, discredit, dismiss. But Jamari had been here before, in different forms, different faces. Teachers who refused to let him skip grades. Principals who called his enthusiasm disruption. A school psychologist who asked if he might be on the spectrum, just because he solved math puzzles faster than adults could read them. Genius was never enough when it wore brown skin and spoke from the mouth of a child who knew what he was worth. And yet in this moment, the world couldn't look away. Ivy League students looked shell-shocked. The professor's lips pressed thin, and somewhere in the upper left-hand corner of the video, if paused just right, one could see Keisha Toles, Jamari's mother, standing tall, expression unreadable, her hands clenched so tight, the skin over her knuckles turned white. She had seen her son's light dimmed before, but not this time, not here. News anchors called it a modern miracle. Tech CEOs reposted the video with captions like "The future is here." Academic blogs dissected the mathematics with admiration. Even the Harvard PR department, usually slow to acknowledge anything not born from legacy or endowment, issued a cautious statement calling Jamari's work impressive and encouraging. But it was Professor Dunning's tweet that ignited the firestorm. "If that boy solves my theorem, I'll retire." He hadn't expected to be taken seriously. It was a joke, a jab, a way to dismiss the noise. But the internet took him at his word, and suddenly, the challenge was everywhere. The unsolved equation had been his legacy project, an academic monster that had outlived 3 faculty chairs and at least 2 PhD cycles. To lose it to a black child would be more than defeat. It would be erasure. Jamari didn't respond publicly. He didn't tweet. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't need to. Because for the first time, the world was finally forced to confront a terrifying truth: that their systems, their institutions, their ivory towers, were not designed to recognize black excellence unless it entertained, conformed, or could be commodified. Jamari had done none of those things. He had just walked in, cracked the code, and walked out. The video was watched over 45 million times in 3 days. But by the end of the week, the tone had shifted. Online think pieces began questioning the video's legitimacy. Right-wing commentators hinted that the problem must have been simplified off-camera. The conspiracy machine spun quickly: photoshopped images, edited clips, accusations of AI deepfakes. It was too much for them to believe. A child with no elite training, no prep school background, and no prestigious lineage had done the impossible. Yet behind all the outrage and applause, the real question remained unanswered. What had pushed Jamari Toles to even walk into that lecture hall? And that answer was buried deep in a string of events no one saw coming. Events rooted not in brilliance but in bias, not in education, but in exclusion. Because Jamari hadn't just wandered into Harvard, he had been pushed by a system that tried to erase him long before the cameras ever rolled. What pushed this young prodigy to even walk into that lecture hall? Long before Harvard and headlines, before the viral video that shook the internet, Jamari Toles lived in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the 8th floor of a battered housing complex on Chicago's West Side. The elevators stuttered, the heat barely worked in winter, and the hallway reeked of bleach and stale fear. Yet even in this setting, brilliance flickered. Jamari was 3 when he began stacking bottle caps into symmetrical towers, matching them by color and shape, with obsessive precision. By 4, he could multiply 2-digit numbers faster than most adults. But none of it seemed to matter. In a world governed by appearances and assumptions, genius didn't count unless it came wrapped in the right package. And Jamari, black and wiry with big eyes and unrelenting questions, never fit the mold they wanted. His mother, Keisha Toles, saw it from the beginning. Working back-to-back nursing shifts, she often came home to find Jamari rearranging cereal boxes by expiration date, drawing number grids on the backs of napkins, or silently mouthing equations in the dark. She tried to get him tested for gifted programs, but the school district brushed her off with polite emails and long waiting lists that mysteriously never moved. When he skipped a whole grade's worth of math homework in one weekend, his teacher accused him of cheating. No one believed a child like Jamari could be both brilliant and black. At parent-teacher conferences, Keisha heard the same phrases repeated like gospel. "He's a disruption to the class. He struggles to stay still. He seems to get bored easily." But beneath their words lay a pattern, an unspoken code, that labeled her son not as gifted, but as a problem. They couldn't control him, so they tried to contain him. And when containment didn't work, they began to push him aside. By 2nd grade, Jamari had been sent to the counselor's office more times than he could count. Not for violence, not for disrespect, but for answering too fast, asking too many questions, and finishing worksheets before the instructions were fully given. They said he lacked discipline. They said he needed structure. What they meant was that he needed to stay in his place. Keisha fought for him relentlessly. She scoured the internet for free STEM camps, begged nonprofit programs to make space, pleaded with overworked administrators to just look at his test scores. But the doors remained closed. Race and zip code formed an invisible wall around Jamari's potential, and every year that passed made it harder to climb. Inside, Jamari began to fold into himself. He stopped raising his hand in class. He stopped showing his work. What was the point? The more he stood out, the more they shoved him down. His notebooks filled with invisible scribbles, proofs, algorithms, number patterns that he never showed anyone, not because he doubted their value, but because he knew exactly what would happen if he did. Still, brilliance finds a way to break through the cracks. At age 9, Jamari discovered an old graphing calculator at a local thrift shop, discarded and buried beneath cracked CDs and tangled cords. It had missing buttons and a glitchy screen, but he carried it everywhere like treasure. He taught himself to reprogram functions using trial and error, watching YouTube videos in the quiet hours after his mother fell asleep. With it, he built a simulation to predict traffic light patterns on the intersections around his neighborhood. Not for a grade, not for approval, just because his mind had to. The neighborhood noticed, but not always kindly. Other kids laughed at him for talking to himself. Some adults warned Keisha that Jamari was acting too smart and might bring trouble his way. Intelligence in their world was sometimes seen as dangerous, especially when it didn't come with protection or pedigree. The emotional toll began to seep in. Keisha saw it in the way her son's shoulders curved forward, how his voice grew quieter over time. He still worked through equations in his head, but no longer with joy, now with urgency, like solving problems was the only thing that made him feel visible. Then came the day that would change everything, though at the time it felt like nothing more than a routine errand. It was a Saturday. The sky hung low with gray clouds, and Keisha, between shifts, decided to take Jamari with her to the grocery store. He brought his calculator, of course, fiddling with a new formula as they navigated narrow aisles. She was comparing prices on cereal when she overheard a quiet dispute 2 carts over, 2 college-age men arguing over probability ratios using words that flew over most shoppers' heads. Jamari froze, listening. Something clicked in his brain, a miscalculation in their logic, a missed variable. Without thinking, he moved closer, watching their hands as they sketched numbers on a receipt with a pen, and then he corrected them. The words spilled out of him in a low, clear voice. A subtle reframe, a redefinition of the base ratio, a better way to map the outcome set. The 2 men looked at him, then each other, then back at Jamari. At first, there was silence. Then came the disbelief. One of them, a grad student from MIT, began asking questions. Jamari answered each one, effortlessly. The stranger pulled out his phone, not in mockery, but wonder, and recorded a snippet of the conversation. Just 30 seconds. A boy in a hoodie, explaining advanced statistical logic, while his mother watched from behind a shopping cart full of discount items. The video was uploaded that night, meant to be shared with a few academic friends, as a novelty, but the internet had other plans. It exploded within hours. What began as a whisper of amazement became a digital roar. Blogs picked it up, educational influencers reshared it. Someone dubbed it the Math Whisperer Kid, and tagged local news. It wasn't even the full depth of Jamari's knowledge, but it was enough to signal something rare, something undeniable. But the sudden spotlight came with sharp edges. Keisha's phone rang non-stop. News stations, radio shows, outreach programs that had previously ignored her emails were now clamoring to meet her son. Teachers who once saw Jamari as a burden now called him a special case and asked for interviews. The very system that once erased him was now trying to claim him. But amid the frenzy, Jamari remained oddly still. He didn't smile for the cameras. He didn't gush about being discovered. In truth, he didn't feel discovered at all. The world hadn't seen him. It had simply tripped over him and was now scrambling to make sense of its own oversight. He wasn't grateful. He was skeptical, because if he hadn't spoken up in that store, if he hadn't interrupted 2 strangers with confidence, they never would have known. And what kind of system only recognizes brilliance if it breaks protocol? The twist came days later, when a formal envelope arrived in the mail, embossed with crimson lettering, marked with a seal Jamari didn't recognize, but Keisha instantly did. It was from Harvard. Inside was an invitation, not for enrollment, not for a scholarship, but for a demonstration. Professor Walter Dunning had seen the video, and he had a proposition. If that boy can solve my equation, I'll retire. Keisha read the words again and again, unsure whether to laugh or scream. Was this a challenge or a trap? Was this praise or a dare? Her instincts screamed caution. Jamari had already been labeled, profiled, boxed in. Was this just another way to humiliate him on a grander stage? But Jamari's expression said something else. Not pride. Not excitement.
Resolve.
He had spent his entire life being boxed in. Maybe this was how he'd break out. Not just for himself, but for every kid like him who never got the chance. A life-altering encounter at a grocery store would flip his future upside down. It had been a long day. Keisha Toles, exhausted from a double shift at the hospital, had planned to skip groceries altogether, but the fridge was almost empty, and payday was still 2 mornings away. Jamari had been unusually quiet that afternoon, scribbling complex variable maps on the back of junk mail, and only pausing when his pencil snapped. Keisha had asked if he wanted to come along, half expecting him to say no. Instead, he nodded without a word and slipped on his hoodie. They stepped into the faded glow of Helston Market, just before closing. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, like static nerves. Faint jazz hummed from cheap speakers. Aisles were half restocked, half forgot. The regulars moved with the slow fatigue of end-of-week survival, cartwheels squeaking against cracked tile. Jamari stayed close to his mother as she picked up cereal, eggs, and discount ground turkey. He wasn't really paying attention. His eyes kept flicking toward a pattern he'd written in his mind, testing it, reworking it. The rhythm of the store beeps from scanners, mutters from nearby shoppers faded under the sound of his own internal equations. That's when he heard them. 2 voices near the self-checkout machines, deep in discussion, teetering on frustration. A man and a woman, late 20s, their tone sharp but intellectual. A debate was unfolding, not over price tags, but probabilities. The man, who wore a gray hoodie with a university crest, held a printed paper between his hands. On it was a question, one of those applied statistics riddles used to screen PhD applicants. Jamari's ears perked. Something was off in their logic. Their variables were misaligned. The outcome set didn't scale properly. The moment he realized it, a ripple moved through him, not excitement but reflex. He stepped forward. Keisha didn't notice at first. She was halfway to the milk fridge when she turned and saw him standing between the 2 strangers, one hand gesturing gently, the other tucked in his pocket. His tone was calm, respectful, focused. The grad student blinked in disbelief. His girlfriend raised an eyebrow. Jamari broke the riddle down into its base logic, rearranged the conditional variables, and reframed the question entirely. Within minutes, the flaw was exposed. The answer fell into place. The man chuckled awkwardly, half in shock, half embarrassed. The woman just stared. Keisha stood frozen at the end of the aisle, unsure whether to intervene or just watch. That's when the bystander pulled out his phone. Not one of the grad students. A third man, middle-aged, baseball cap, Bluetooth earpiece, shopping cart with nothing but bottled water and canned beans. He filmed quietly from behind the magazine rack, only raising his phone higher once Jamari began writing a second solution on the back of a receipt. The grad student handed him. The video lasted 49 seconds. It captured Jamari, hunched slightly forward, reworking probability into clarity. His voice never rose. His hands moved with careful certainty. There was no performance, no boast, no need to impress. He wasn't trying to go viral. He was trying to solve. They left the store that night with plastic bags biting into Keisha's wrists, and no idea what had just begun. The video was uploaded with a caption. Random kid at the grocery store just schooled a grad student in stats? It sat dormant for a few hours, gaining slow traction among niche math communities. By sunrise, it had been picked up by a popular STEM-focused TikTok creator, who stitched the clip with exaggerated commentary and a shocked expression. That's when it detonated. 10 million views in under 2 days. Jamari's face was now plastered across screens around the world. His hoodie, his soft-spoken tone, his confident fingers folding probability into submission. The world fell in love with him, or rather the sanitized, palatable version they saw. The praise poured in. News anchors called him a young genius. Influencers dubbed him the statistical savant. Schools that had never returned Keisha's calls were now asking to feature Jamari on their brochures. Scholarships and program invites flooded in. TEDx organizers, coding boot camps, tech startups. Everyone wanted a piece of the math prodigy from aisle 5. But then came the venom. The internet's affection turned rapidly into scrutiny. Anonymous accounts demanded proof. Twitter threads dissected the clip, insisting the problem had been pre-planted. Reddit forums speculated that the grad student had been in on it. Theories ranged from parental coaching to scripted performance. One user posted, "No 10-year-old from the South Side is solving grad-level math without help. Let's be real." Keisha's email was hacked. Her social media flooded with coded insults and veiled threats. News outlets reported on Jamari's brilliance by day and doubted it in editorials by night. Some even suggested that the video was part of a political stunt aimed at boosting DEI optics in STEM. But the ugliest part came from the comment sections. Some comments were subtle, hidden in sarcasm and tone. Others were not.
That he can't read, though.
Let's see him do that without a calculator. Affirmative action already working overtime. Dumb parents shoving him into the spotlight for clout. Jamari read some of them. Keisha tried to stop him, but she wasn't fast enough. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just shut down. For 2 days he didn't touch his calculator. He barely spoke. He retreated into silence, so deep, it terrified his mother more than anything the internet could say. But something shifted on the 3rd day. Jamari got out of bed, before sunrise. He sat at the kitchen table, pencil in hand, and began writing again. Line after line of conditional permutations, recursive loops and algorithmic derivatives. He didn't do it for the internet. He did it because it was the only place the world made sense. What Keisha didn't know, what no one knew, was that somewhere in a cluttered office inside Harvard's Department of Mathematics, a tired old man clicked on the video for the 6th time. Professor Walter Dunning watched Jamari's face in slow motion. He saw the stillness, the certainty, the calculation not just of numbers, but of space and silence. This wasn't mimicry. This was real. And to Dunning, it was dangerous. The professor had spent his entire career building mathematical frameworks so abstract they bordered on art. He had prided himself on problems no student could ever solve. He enjoyed watching pupils squirm in his lectures, dismantled by riddles no one dared challenge. He had become a gatekeeper not just of knowledge, but of access. And now on his screen was a child, a black child, who had done what many of his own grad students could not. He played the clip again, and again. By midnight he drafted a tweet he didn't expect to go anywhere. It read, "If that boy solves my unsolved theorem, I'll retire." The tweet was meant as a taunt, a way to reassert control. A jab cloaked in academic arrogance. He didn't know it yet, but that tweet would set off a chain of events that not even he could calculate. One of those views came from Harvard's most controversial mathematics professor. Professor Walter Dunning had seen it all, or at least that's what he told himself. 42 years inside Harvard's marble walls had hardened him into an immovable force, one that no tenure board dared challenge, no department chair dared correct. To undergraduates, he was a living legend. To graduate students, a necessary evil. And to anyone not already in his inner academic circle, he was a closed door with no handle. They called him the final filter, a nickname whispered in dread by students entering his notoriously brutal advanced mathematics seminars. His classroom was a mental crucible. No calculators, no partial credit, and certainly no second chances. Mistakes were dissected publicly. Confusion was mocked lightly but unmistakably. Some said he enjoyed watching students squirm more than seeing them succeed. But behind the curated professionalism of his public persona lay something darker, something invisible, to those who had never stood on the wrong side of his expectations. Walter Dunning didn't say racist things. He didn't need to. He spoke through structure, through pattern, through silence. Year after year, the names he elevated followed a familiar rhythm. David, Emily, Charles, Catherine. The faces on his recommendation letters rarely reflected the diverse student body Harvard liked to photograph. His praise was selective. His patience, conditioned. He claimed to be colorblind, which somehow always ended with black and brown students being overlooked, undergraded, or quietly advised to refocus their interests. He had never been officially challenged, never publicly accused, and he liked it that way. His power lay in subtlety, in gatekeeping, in the quiet confidence that no one would ever dare accuse a man of his stature of systemic bias. Until that video, the moment he watched Jamari Toles solve the probability riddle in that grocery store. Something in his chest tightened, not with awe but irritation. He replayed the clip multiple times, each pass chiseling deeper into his pride. The boy was composed, unshaken, and worst of all, right. Dunning didn't believe in coincidences. To him, the viral nature of the video felt engineered, performative, even manipulative. He convinced himself it was part of a growing movement to dilute academia with spectacle. But deep down, he knew the problem hadn't been prearranged. The boy's logic was authentic. That made it worse. His tweet wasn't drafted in anger, but in control. It was carefully designed to reframe the narrative, to put Jamari in a box before the public could elevate him further. If that boy solves my unsolved problem, I'll retire. It sounded like respect, like a rare nod from a man who never nodded. But it was a trap, a tightrope stretched over flames, because Dunning's problem wasn't just difficult, it was unsolvable. By design, it had taken him over a decade to craft, a multi-dimensional function, laced with recursive permutations, stochastic projections, and a layered probabilistic matrix. It existed as both proof and puzzle, a monument to his own intellect. No student had come close to cracking it. Most professors couldn't even follow its construction. It was his legacy, his fingerprint on mathematical eternity. He knew Jamari would see the tweet. He knew the boy's mother, who appeared weary and sharp in the background of the video, would see it too. And he knew better than anyone how easily a challenge like this could bait a young mind into self-destruction. What he didn't expect was the backlash. The tweet, intended as an academic mic drop, was interpreted by the public as a sincere offer. Suddenly, he was being hailed as open-minded, even generous. "Look at this professor encouraging the next generation," wrote one educator on LinkedIn. Others called it historic, inspirational, a bridge between generations. Dunning watched the praise accumulate with a dry smile. If only they knew. His office became a war room. He pulled out the original formulation of the equation. 6 handwritten pages covered in indecipherable glyphs and symbolic chaos, and began tweaking. Not to simplify, but to reinforce. He doubled down on variables, tripled the recursive layers. Each adjustment made the theorem less penetrable, more twisted. He didn't just want to defeat Jamari, he wanted to break him. Harvard's administration, caught off guard by the sudden publicity, issued a vague press release supporting cross-generational intellectual collaboration. Behind closed doors, they panicked. The last thing the university wanted was controversy, especially the kind that spotlighted racial bias from within its own faculty. But Dunning was untouchable. He held 3 endowed chairs. He had published in every major mathematical journal. His name was etched into the university's academic lineage. There were buildings on campus that bore his donations. Challenging him would be academic suicide. Still, a quiet unrest stirred within the faculty. Some younger professors questioned the ethics of pitting a child against a legacy problem designed to crush egos. Others whispered about Dunning's history, how students of color often disappeared from his programs after the first semester. Nothing was ever proven, but the pattern was there. Meanwhile, Jamari remained silent. He hadn't tweeted, hadn't responded to reporters. The world waited, breath held, for his answer. But inside his small apartment in Chicago, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at a printed copy of Dunning's problem. His pencil tapped rhythmically. He'd read it 15 times, not to memorize, but to feel its architecture, to understand what lay beneath the symbol. Keisha hovered near the sink, arms folded, eyes weary. She had seen enough. Enough of how the world praised her son one moment, and turned on him the next. Enough of the headlines that pretended to uplift while feeding on spectacle. This wasn't a gift. It was a stage trap, a moment engineered to either exploit Jamari's genius or humiliate him under the spotlight. She told him no, flatly, firmly. Harvard didn't deserve him. But Jamari, who had spent most of his life being ignored, misjudged and boxed in, wasn't chasing Harvard's approval. He was chasing something else, something only he could see. This problem was more than a test. It was a lock, and he had the key. Still, Keisha didn't budge. Not until the doorbell rang late one evening, days after the tweet had gone viral. On the other side stood a woman in a crisp charcoal coat, holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression Keisha couldn't read. She introduced herself as Victoria Hensley, former tech executive, Harvard alum, and one of the most influential black women in the STEM funding world. She didn't come to sway Keisha. She came with receipts, documents, records, names. In that envelope were years of faculty evaluations, anonymous student complaints, and buried reports, all pointing to a pattern of exclusion, specifically toward black students in Dunning's programs. Victoria knew the game. She'd played it, lost in some rooms, won in others. She didn't just want Jamari to solve the problem. She wanted the world to see why the problem had been constructed the way it was, and who had always been kept from it. Jamari wasn't just a prodigy to her, he was a reckoning. Keisha stood frozen, the weight of it pressing against her ribs. She looked at her son, who was still seated at the table, quiet and focused. This wasn't just about a math problem anymore. It was about dismantling the lie that genius only looked one way, sounded one way, came from one place. Jamari's mother didn't want him anywhere near that university. Keisha Tolles held the Harvard letter in trembling hands, not because of pride or excitement, but because it smelled too much like a trap. Not the obvious kind, wrapped in threat or insult, but the quiet kind. The kind that lured black boys in with applause and left them bleeding from expectations too heavy to carry. The document didn't use the word challenge. It was framed as an opportunity, a visit, a collaboration between generations. But Keisha had read enough history to recognize the pattern. She knew the names: Emmett, Trayvon, Tamir, boys whose intelligence, presence, or even playfulness was perceived as threat. There was something in this invitation that echoed that same danger, only this time, it wore a silk tie and an Ivy League crest. Victoria Hensley's visit had rattled her. Not because the woman was wrong. Everything she said about Dunning's record, about Harvard's unspoken hierarchy, about the war being fought in classrooms rather than streets. It was all true. But even with evidence, even with allies, the weight of what they were asking of her son felt unbearable. Keisha didn't want Jamari to become a martyr for merit. He was only 10. She'd raised him with love and boundaries, protecting his genius while shielding him from systems designed to exploit it. Now the same system that ignored him wanted to place him in front of cameras and microphones, hoping to showcase diversity while feeding him to a lion in tweed. But Jamari wasn't afraid. He sat at the kitchen table night after night, eyes locked on Dunning's theorem, like it was a living creature daring him to blink. He didn't see a trap, he saw a wall, and he was born to break through walls, not because he wanted to impress Harvard, but because the equation itself spoke to him in a language only he understood. To him it wasn't personal, it was mathematical, it was inevitable. Still, Keisha resisted. She deleted interview requests. She ignored media inquiries. She even drafted an email to Harvard, thanking them for their interest, but declining on health and family stability grounds. She never sent it. Because every night, Jamari pushed deeper into the theorem. She heard the way his pencil scratched the margins of graph paper. She saw the moment he realized that one of the recursive layers inside the equation looped back with a flaw. Not a mistake, but an opening. It wasn't just that he was capable. He needed to do this. Keisha prayed over it. She consulted her pastor. She sat with herself in silence. And eventually, she did what mothers have done for generations. She chose to support her child, even when every instinct screamed to keep him close and safe. They boarded the Amtrak train to Cambridge 2 weeks later, with 2 suitcases, a backpack of notes, and a silence thick with conflicting emotions. The train was half full, mostly quiet. Students returning from fall break, older couples heading to the Northeast for foliage season, business travelers asleep with earbuds in. Keisha sat beside Jamari, arms folded, watching the window as the landscape blurred from cityscape to woods. Jamari pulled out his notebook and began sketching formulas again, flipping pages back and forth. Keisha tried to rest but couldn't. Every stop made her pulse quicken. Every eye that lingered too long on her son made her jaw tighten. Halfway through the journey, somewhere near Albany, an older white man in a tailored jacket stood from the far end of the car and slowly made his way down the aisle. He didn't smile, didn't greet anyone. He paused near Jamari's seat, looked down at the pages of equations sprawled in his lap, and scoffed, not loudly, but with enough disdain to sting. Keisha turned, locking eyes with the man. He nodded once, curtly, as if the mere presence of advanced mathematics in a black child's hands was somehow distasteful. He moved on without a word. Jamari didn't look up, but his pencil stopped. For the rest of the trip he didn't write another symbol. The encounter was brief, almost forgettable. But to Jamari, it felt like a mirror. He had grown used to being underestimated in his neighborhood, in classrooms, even in media narratives. But this was different. This man didn't just doubt his ability, he was offended by it, as though excellence, in his hands, was theft. For the first time since the invitation, doubt crept into Jamari's chest, not about the math, but about the outcome. Even if he solved it, what would it change? Would they believe him? Would they accept it? Or would they find a new way to discredit him, redefine the rules, or reframe the moment, to fit a story that didn't make room for kids like him? The train rolled into Cambridge late afternoon, golden light pouring through the windows as the historic spires of Harvard came into view. Keisha reached over and touched her son's shoulder, but he didn't turn. His fingers were still, resting on the closed notebook, his eyes fixed on the floor. In that moment, he wasn't the prodigy. He was just a child, scared that no matter how precise his mind was, the world would always move the goalposts. Keisha recognized the look. She'd worn it once herself, when she was denied admission to nursing school, because her community college credits didn't align with expectations. She'd cried in the stairwell that night, not because she failed, but because she hadn't been allowed to even play the same game. She leaned in, whispering the only truth she could offer, that the world might not be fair, but their truth was undeniable. Jamari didn't reply. They disembarked into the chill of Massachusetts autumn, shoulders brushing against students with lanyards and branded hoodies. Some stared, most ignored. They weren't greeted with banners or faculty, just a student volunteer holding a sign that read, "Toll's family, room." Their accommodations were modest, one of the old dormitory rooms converted into a guest suite. It smelled of varnish and old books. The radiator hissed. The window overlooked a courtyard where students laughed over coffee and midterm misery. Jamari sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the notebook now folded in half. The silence between him and his mother thickened into something neither of them could name. She broke it by unpacking his clothes. And he finally spoke, not with words but by standing up, retrieving the notebook, and pinning a single page to the corkboard near the desk. It was the theorem. Dunning's trap. Still unresolved. Still snarling. Only this time Jamari drew a circle around a section in the middle, and underlined one line of it twice. Keisha saw it and frowned, because what Jamari had circled wasn't a mistake. It was something missing. On the train to Cambridge, something happened that made Jamari question the entire trip. After 2 days in Cambridge, touring the perimeter of the campus, reviewing Jamari's notes, and fielding cold smiles from faculty assistants, Keisha decided it was time to fly back home for a few days before the upcoming challenge. The university had offered to cover travel expenses, citing educational partnership. She didn't trust their sudden generosity, but she didn't argue either. Their return flight was short, Boston to Chicago, 2 hours and change. The plane boarded in quiet efficiency. Jamari wore headphones and held his tablet, stylus poised, lost in a sequence of recursive integers he'd been modeling since the train ride. The window seat beside him was filled with light, a wide expanse of blue and cloud stretching beyond his small frame. Keisha sat in the aisle seat, tired but relieved. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself a sliver of calm. The trip hadn't exploded into disaster. Jamari hadn't frozen. He hadn't folded under pressure. There were moments, brief ones, where she could almost see him enjoying the process again. Almost. But peace, for families like hers, was rarely interrupted. An hour into the flight, the cabin was quiet. Most passengers had settled into movies or sleep. Jamari continued working. His stylus moved in short, precise strokes. The screen displayed a grid of formulas overlaid with color-coded loops and probability arcs. Keisha glanced over once, then rested her eyes. And that's when the flight attendant appeared. She was polite, too polite. Blonde uniform crisp, smile frozen. She crouched beside Keisha's seat with a practiced calm that felt rehearsed. Someone, she said, had raised a concern. A passenger sitting a few rows back claimed Jamari had been acting strange and appeared to be coding something suspicious on his device. The attendant assured them it was probably nothing, but protocol required them to check. Keisha blinked. She didn't understand at first. Then she turned to Jamari's screen. Equations. Graphs. Nothing but math. Keisha stiffened. She asked what exactly was suspicious. The attendant, still in her professional tone, said it was probably a misunderstanding, and they just need to take a look after landing. It's for everyone's safety, she added, as if those words could excuse the tightening in Keisha's chest. Jamari didn't speak. He simply lowered the tablet, eyes flicking between his mother and the attendant. His hands were steady, but his silence was louder than any protest. They weren't asked to move seats. No announcement was made. The plane landed without fanfare. But as they stepped into the terminal, the trap became clear. At the gate stood two TSA officers, flanked by airport security. Their postures were rigid, faces blank. One officer, a white man with a thin mustache and sharp jaw, motioned for Keisha and Jamari to step aside. They were taken to a small room near baggage claim. No glass walls, no explanations. Keisha demanded to know why. The officers were vague. A report had been filed. Something about unusual behavior on a plane. When Keisha asked what exactly constituted unusual, the answers blurred into jargon, unidentifiable digital activity, visual patterns, possible foreign characters. Keisha stared at them in disbelief. Her son was 10. He was writing math. The unspoken part hung in the air like poison. It wasn't what Jamari was doing. It was who was doing it. He wasn't a white kid writing code. He wasn't wearing a robotics club hoodie. He wasn't sitting next to a MacBook covered in STEM is for everyone stickers. He was a black boy, drawing loops and logic paths on a glowing screen. And that, in someone's eyes, made him dangerous. They were held for 43 minutes. No questions asked of Jamari. No formal investigation. No charges filed. Eventually a supervisor arrived, slightly more apologetic than the others, and quietly told them they were free to go. No one said sorry.
No one explained who made the report.
Keisha didn't yell. She didn't cry. But as they walked toward the baggage carousel, she burned. Rage simmered under her skin, too familiar to surprise her but too heavy to ignore. Jamari didn't say anything. He clutched his backpack tighter, face unreadable. She wanted to tell him it wasn't about him, that the world had problems it refused to fix. But the truth was, it was about him, about what his skin, his age, and his intellect combined to represent, something the world hadn't learned how to respect without fear. They arrived at baggage claim in silence. The carousel had just started spinning. Bags thudded onto the belt. Keisha scanned for their luggage when she noticed something out of place. A black limousine parked just beyond the sliding glass doors, glossy and sharp, the kind reserved for celebrities or CEOs. She narrowed her eyes. On the door, just barely visible in the reflection of the glass, was the crimson Harvard crest. Jamari noticed it too. They stepped closer cautiously. A driver in a pressed suit stepped forward, nodded politely, and opened the rear passenger door. Keisha hesitated. This wasn't part of the plan. No one had mentioned a car. No one from Harvard had confirmed anything beyond flight expenses. Inside the limo sat someone they hadn't seen before. A young woman, brown skin, close-cropped hair, dark-rimmed glasses. She looked barely 30, but carried herself like someone used to boardrooms. Her hands were clasped, her expression unreadable. She introduced herself simply, formally, through the open door. She wasn't part of Harvard's administration. She wasn't a math professor. She was something else entirely. And the reason she was there would rewrite everything. Keisha thought she knew about this challenge. Waiting for them at baggage claim was a limousine with the Harvard crest, and someone unexpected inside. The leather interior of the limousine was cold, the scent of eucalyptus diffusers clashing with the tension that gripped Keisha's throat the moment she stepped in. Jamari followed behind her, backpack still slung over one shoulder, his face a mask of curiosity cloaked in caution. The woman seated across from them extended her hand calmly. She didn't introduce herself with fanfare or title. Just a quiet Victoria Hensley. Keisha recognized the name instantly, though it took her brain a few seconds to process it. Victoria Hensley wasn't just a name. She was the name one of the most powerful black women in tech. A billionaire turned philanthropist. A Harvard alum who'd walked away from the Silicon Valley machine to build her own empire on her terms. But what was she doing here? Victoria wasted no time. The car pulled out from the curb, and with it the conversation leapt into motion. She explained that she'd seen the original grocery store video before it went viral. She had eyes everywhere. Algorithms, alerts, and people. When you had money and motive, visibility wasn't an issue. She hadn't just watched the video. She'd intervened. It was her team that amplified it quietly through targeted reposts. Her foundation had shared it with the right voices. It wasn't manipulation, she insisted. It was exposure, the kind that wouldn't come from the media alone. And she didn't do it for clout. She did it because she had a score to settle with Harvard. Keisha listened, lips pressed tight, her hands gripping her purse. Jamari stared straight ahead, processing every word. Victoria spoke of her time on campus 2 decades ago, how she'd been the only black woman in her applied math program, how her innovations in neural computation were dismissed until white classmates repeated them. She recalled being ignored, corrected, erased, her name omitted from published papers, her advisor praising the team, but never her. And then came the final blow, a white male peer who plagiarized her thesis code and graduated with highest honors, while she was told to focus on building soft skills Harvard had taken from her. Now she had returned the favor, only from the shadows. Victoria had funded a quiet endowment, buried under a different name, that pressured Dunning into issuing the challenge. She knew his ego. She knew his legacy obsession. She didn't need to bribe him. She just had to bait him. The challenge was never about solving the equation. It was about exposing the rot. But now, with the public watching, the stakes had changed. The world had turned Jamari into a symbol, something pure, powerful, and innocent. But to Victoria, he was more than that. He was proof that their gatekeeping had failed. Still, Keisha didn't relax. Her gut remained tight, her breath shallow. She appreciated the truth, respected the honesty. But it also meant Jamari had been placed in a fight he hadn't chosen, with enemies he couldn't see. And what if he failed? Victoria's eyes didn't flinch when Keisha asked the question. Then the facade cracked, just slightly. Failure wouldn't ruin Jamari. Not in her eyes. But it would allow Harvard to walk away unscathed. It would validate every whisper that said his talent was exaggerated, every comment that framed him as a fluke, a media creation. It would solidify Dunning's myth and bury another black prodigy under the weight of institutional memory loss. Jamari absorbed the moment, like code, quietly, completely. He asked one question. What would happen if he won? Victoria's smile returned. If he won, it wouldn't just be a headline. It would be a breach, a fault line across the polished image. Harvard sold to the world. It would raise questions they couldn't silence. It would make space for others, not because Harvard allowed it, but because someone forced the door open. They arrived back at the guest dorm, the car pulling quietly into the rear lot reserved for faculty. Victoria didn't step out. She handed Jamari a slim manila folder before they exited. Inside it was a single document, handwritten by Dunning years ago, outlining an earlier version of the equation. Less complex, more vulnerable, a glimpse into the problem's original DNA. Jamari held the paper like a cipher. Keisha didn't say thank you. Victoria didn't expect her to. Back in the dorm room, the light felt colder, the air thinner. Jamari sat on the edge of the bed, unfolding the old version of the problem, cross-referencing it with his own notes. The differences were small, but meaningful. Where Dunning had added complexity, Jamari saw patterns designed to confuse, not illuminate. Noise dressed as genius. Keisha watched him, torn between admiration and fear. She no longer doubted his ability, but she feared what the world might do with it. Later that night, after she fell asleep, Jamari wandered outside. The campus was quiet, brick paths glowing under golden lamplight, trees rustling faintly in the night breeze. He moved toward the quad, tablet tucked under his arm, hoodie pulled over his head. He didn't notice the footsteps at first. But then came the voices, low, hushed, close. 2 young men. White. Students. They were behind him, just far enough to not be accidental. One of them muttered something sharp under his breath. The words weren't meant to be heard clearly, but Jamari caught enough. No way he belongs here. The words sliced, not because they were new, but because they were expected. Even here. Even now. Jamari kept walking, refusing to flinch. But deep down, the calculation had shifted. This wasn't just about solving the problem anymore. It was about surviving what came after. That night, Jamari was followed on campus by 2 white students whispering, "No way he belongs here." The dorm room had no business housing a child prodigy the night before the most scrutinized academic moment of his life. Its floor creaked. The mattress was thin, the heating uneven, and the whiteboard provided by the university had a crack down the lower right corner. The only source of light was a flickering desk lamp that buzzed when left on too long. But Jamari Tulls didn't notice any of that. He was building proofs, the kind of mental structures most graduate students wouldn't dare approach without months of research. Recursive patterns bloomed across the whiteboard, like ivy, symbols connected in quiet harmony, rebalancing probabilities. collapsing chaos into clean logic. Jamari's mind moved fast, but his hand moved faster, streamlining paths through Dunning's tangled legacy one pencil stroke at a time. Keisha sat behind him, watching in silence. Her phone buzzed constantly, vibrating with notifications she refused to check. She'd seen enough already. Keep Harvard Pure was trending. The hashtag started in a small Reddit thread, an anonymous post claiming Harvard was under attack from media manipulation and woke politics, but within hours it had jumped to Twitter, picked up by alt-right influencers and pseudo-academic blogs. They posted photos of Jamari, often edited with red filters and coded language. They questioned his age, his education, his citizenship. One article suggested he was an actor hired by progressive tech elites. Another mocked his mother's past job history, painting her as a welfare queen turned opportunist. Keisha had cried in the bathroom when she saw that one. Quietly so Jamari wouldn't hear. But he knew. He always knew. He'd paused for only a moment when she returned, his eyes flickering to her swollen lids. Then he turned back to the board. He wasn't ignoring it. He was overriding it. Campus police walked past the room twice that night. The first time was early evening, just after Victoria had texted Keisha a heads up that protesters had been spotted near the South Quad. The second time was after midnight. No knock, just shadows under the door and the soft click of radio chatter. No incident report was filed, no concern was raised, but their presence was felt, like the constant hum of a system waiting for a reason. Keisha had packed their bags quietly around one. She told Jamari they could still leave, that they didn't owe anyone anything, that brilliance wasn't meant to be sacrificed for spectacle. She listed everything they'd already proven. The video, the flight, the viral equation. She tried to wrap it in love, but Jamari saw the fear under it all. He told her to unpack. She didn't argue this time. She just sat on the bed, hands trembling in her lap, while her son continued scribbling formulaic sequences that felt more like battle plans than math. Outside, the campus buzzed with a strange energy. Some students were supportive. They left sticky notes on the dorm door. "You got this. Change the game. They don't see us, but we see you." Others weren't as subtle. Someone slipped a note under the door, around 2:30 a.m. A single piece of printer paper, with 2 words, "Your fiction." Jamari picked it up without flinching. He didn't throw it away. He didn't speak. He just folded it into a square and slid it into his backpack beneath his notebook, beneath his diagrams. Around 3:00 a.m., he finally stopped writing. The board was full. His hands were cramping. But the equation was clearer now. Not solved, but close. The path was opening. Keisha placed a hand on his shoulder. He leaned into it briefly, just enough for her to feel that he was still present, still grounded, still hers. Then he pulled away gently and crawled into bed, fully clothed, his backpack zipped and ready beside him. She lay awake for hours, her eyes never leaving the door. And when dawn finally cracked through the blinds, painting the walls in thin gold light, the knock came. It wasn't campus security. It wasn't media. It was a university intern sent to escort them. Jamari rose without a word. He slipped into his hoodie, double-checked his backpack, and stepped into his sneakers. Keisha moved slower, every limb heavy with dread. The walk across campus was surreal. Students lined the sidewalks, some holding signs. "Let him solve it. Break the equation. Truth has no age." A few reporters trailed behind, whispering into microphones, camera crews hanging back as instructed. But when they entered the mathematics hall, everything changed. The lecture hall was already standing room only. Every seat was filled. The walls were lined with students, professors, visiting academics. Journalists filled the back rows, adjusting boom mics and lenses. 2 rows of lights had been installed overnight by a national news crew. Granted exclusive access, a podium sat in the far corner, unused. All eyes were locked on the massive whiteboard that dominated the front of the room. At its center was the equation, scrawled in Dunning's signature hand, untouched since the day he announced the challenge. Jamari froze just inside the doorway. Keisha felt his breath shift. For the first time he looked small. Not intellectually, not emotionally, but physically, dwarfed by the room, by the attention, by the sheer weight of a system that had now gathered like a storm to witness whether he would rise or fall. And somewhere in the 3rd row, seated alone in a charcoal gray suit, Walter Dunning leaned back in his chair, watching with the faintest of smiles. The next morning, the lecture hall was standing room only, plus a national news crew. The temperature in the room dropped the moment Professor Walter Dunning stood. He approached the whiteboard like a priest approaching an altar, slow, deliberate, authoritative. His movements were neither rushed nor theatrical. They didn't have to be. The room was already his. He held a fresh marker in his hand like a scalpel, the plastic squeaking faintly as he uncapped it. The sound echoed off the stone walls of the lecture hall. Then he began to write. To the untrained eye, the equation looked like gibberish, an unforgiving tangle of nested variables, summations, Greek symbols, tensor transformations, recursive matrices. But to the few mathematicians in the room who did understand, it was nothing short of academic violence. An intricate beast of a problem, beautiful in its brutality, and intentionally unsolvable under traditional linear analysis. Dunning didn't explain it. He never did. That was part of the mythology. Let the symbols speak, let the student suffer. As the final symbols dried under the lights, he turned and placed the marker down, with mechanical precision. His eyes met Jamari's briefly. No smile, no challenge, just the expectation of collapse. The auditorium fell silent. Jamari stepped forward. There was no introduction, no speech, just the quiet shuffle of his sneakers across the polished floor. As he approached the whiteboard, with a single black marker of his own. He was small in comparison to the board, but there was nothing hesitant in his grip. He scanned the problem once. Then, with steady hands, he reached up and began to erase. Gasps rippled across the room. He wasn't solving it the way anyone expected. He wasn't adding steps. He wasn't following Dunning's structure. He was dismantling it. Jamari didn't look at the audience, didn't glance at his notes. His mind moved like a scalpel, slicing through unnecessary complexity, bypassing obfuscations. Dunning had built over decades. He saw the architecture beneath the deception, the foundation beneath the vanity. The first line he rewrote removed a recursive loop that appeared elegant but was functionally redundant. Then he struck a second layer, an exponential stack designed to disorient. Each adjustment shocked the mathematicians watching. This wasn't guesswork. It wasn't memorization. It was clarity, the kind that could only come from someone who wasn't trained how to see the problem but trained himself to see through it. Murmurs broke out in the third and fourth rows. Not derision, not disbelief, recognition. Jamari wasn't just solving the problem. He was exposing it. Dunning shifted in his seat. At the halfway point, the board looked different. Smaller, cleaner. The massive tangle had been reduced by a third. Symbols flowed in alignment. The knots had been untied. And then came the moment that snapped the room in half. Jamari paused. He stepped back slightly, eyes scanning the board. And then, without hesitation, he picked a section near the bottom, a part no one had expected him to touch, and erased it completely. Every professor in the room froze. That section wasn't just advanced, it was sacred. It was the heart of the equation, the core that Dunning had defended as untouchable. Jamari didn't hesitate. He redrew it with entirely new notation, symbols unfamiliar to many in the room, combinations not yet published in academic papers, structures birthed from Jamari's own mind. One professor audibly gasped. Dunning sat forward. He recognized the rewrite, not because he'd taught it, but because he'd discarded it 10 years ago. The boy was using a theoretical framework that Dunning himself had once explored and abandoned because it made his problem solvable too quickly. Now that framework was re-emerging, cleaner, stronger, rebalanced by a child who had never seen Dunning's notes. Jamari had reverse-engineered the discarded path, not from access, but from instinct. The irony burned. This wasn't supposed to happen. The cameras captured everything. Victoria Hensley, seated quietly near the back, didn't blink. She'd seen brilliance before. But what Jamari was doing now wasn't just brilliance. It was rebellion written in math. The audience held its collective breath as Jamari continued. He wasn't speeding through it. He was orchestrating it. Every step was deliberate, like notes in a melody only he could hear. He rewrote the final structure not as a solution, but as a transformation, reshaping the equation from an academic monument into something that could teach, not intimidate. And that's when Dunning's face changed. Not a full reaction, not a collapse, but a slight movement, eyebrows tightening, jaw shifting. Color drained from his cheeks. Because he knew. He knew what Jamari was building. The audience didn't see it yet, but Dunning did. He recognized the pivot point Jamari was approaching, the proof pattern, the simplification vector, the logical recursion. It was working. And if it kept working, it would mean only one thing. He was about to be defeated. Halfway through the solution, Dunning's face went pale. The marker moved in Jamari's hand like it was wired to something deeper than muscle memory. Like it flowed from a place beneath language, beneath fear. Every line he drew rewrote the story that had been told for decades. The equation was no longer a wall. It was a doorway, and Jamari wasn't just walking through it. He was leaving it open for everyone behind him. The final phase of his solution wasn't about expansion. It was reduction. This was the part no one expected. Not even the mathematicians who now stood at the edges of their seats, jaws slack, eyes wide. Jamari wasn't finishing the problem with brute force or brute memory. He was simplifying it. He saw something Dunning hadn't. A projection model. Nested deep inside the original framework was a redundancy loop, disguised as complexity. Most solvers assumed it was vital, an ornamental piece of abstract math that gave the problem weight and legacy. But Jamari had pulled it apart in his mind and found what lay underneath. The equation's core could be mirrored, using a predictive model that reduced 3 entire layers of recursion into one clear, adaptable framework. It wasn't just more elegant. It was better. He rewrote the final transformation, using a 3-variable projection function he'd modeled himself on paper, alone, weeks before the challenge. No software, no mentor, just thought in pencil. It clicked into place with shocking clarity. The whiteboard was silent, but the room wasn't. Gasps spilled forward like a wave. A few students clapped instinctively before cutting themselves off. A professor in the second row dropped his pen. Someone near the media riser cursed under their breath. They all saw it. Not just a solution, but a revolution. A piece of math that had existed as a monolith for years, meant to humiliate, to gatekeep, to remind students where the ceiling was, had been reframed into a bridge. And it had been done by a 10-year-old black boy, with no institutional training, no prep school education, no lineage of Ivy League brilliance. Just vision. Dunning didn't speak. He stared. Jamari turned, slowly, eyes meeting the professor's. Not with triumph. Not with smugness. With clarity. With calm. Dunning rose from his seat with unnatural stillness. He said nothing, didn't acknowledge the audience, didn't offer a rebuttal, or a challenge, or even a breath of resistance. He walked out. Silence followed him like a shadow. Then cameras did too. Photographers stumbled over cords. Reporters whispered into microphones. The professor's departure wasn't just dramatic. It was historic. A man who had spent decades owning that room had just abandoned it. Keisha stood near the back, frozen. She hadn't breathed properly, in what felt like minutes. Her hands trembled at her sides, but her eyes were steady. She didn't cry. She didn't clap. She just watched her son stand taller than the institution that had tried to define him. Victoria Hensley leaned forward in her seat, lips pressed into a smile that held no joy, just justice. The equation now complete. Jamari stepped away from the board and placed the marker gently on the tray. He didn't wait for questions. He didn't bask in applause. He simply walked back to the center of the room, sat beside his mother, and opened his notebook again, as if the most radical academic moment of the decade hadn't just unfolded. But outside, the storm was gathering. In the hallway, Dunning moved like a man submerged. He was pale, his gait uneven, his lips muttered to no one. A cluster of faculty members followed at a distance. They weren't whispering his name. They were whispering Jamari's. The younger professors, the ones who had long suspected Dunning's methods were more show than substance, had their phones out, eyes wide, voices urgent. One leaned into another. "We need to get ahead of this." Another replied, louder, "Don't let this go public yet." The hallway buzzed. This wasn't just a classroom upset. It was a threat to the architecture of power. Because if a child, especially this child, could dismantle Dunning's problem in front of witnesses and cameras, then everything that had been protected, preserved and praised by the system would come under scrutiny. It wasn't just about ego anymore. It was about control. In the hallway, a group of faculty whispered urgently, "Don't let this go public yet." By the time the sun dipped behind the Harvard skyline, the world was already waiting for a headline that never came. News outlets had been buzzing for hours. Twitter timelines were ablaze. TikTok creators were flooding feeds with reactions and analysis. Jamari Tolles was trending across platforms, and clips of him solving the problem of Dunning walking out in silence had been reposted millions of times. The moment demanded acknowledgement. But when Harvard finally responded, the statement arrived with all the fanfare of an automated out-of-office email. It was a 3-paragraph release posted to the university website under the departmental news tab. No social post, no press conference, no interview. The headline read, "Collaborative event showcases the future of mathematical thought." There was no mention of Jamari by name.
No image.
No statement from Dunning. The text was cold, surgical. It described the event as an exciting intergenerational academic dialogue, framing Jamari's solution as the product of diverse perspectives contributing to long-standing challenges. There were vague references to emerging voices and student-led inspiration, but nothing about what had actually happened. It didn't just feel dismissive. It felt intentional. Keisha read the statement aloud in their dorm that evening, her voice growing tighter with every word. When she finished, she looked at her son still seated at the desk, scribbling patterns into a notebook with eerie calm. He didn't react. Not with anger. Not with sadness. Just silence. Victoria was not as restrained. Within minutes of reading the statement, she was on the phone with journalists, board members, and tech allies. She knew exactly what this was. She'd seen it before. When Black excellence breaks the model, institutions don't uplift it. They absorb it, water it down, attribute it to teamwork or community support. The idea of a singular Black child solving an academic enigma was too disruptive for their narrative. So they blurred it. They whitewashed it. What made it worse was what didn't happen. There was no interview request from Harvard, no call from the president's office, no invitation to Jamari or Keisha for a follow-up meeting, a congratulatory gathering, or even a handshake. Dunning had vanished, and the university, silent as a tomb, was acting like none of it had ever happened. The room where it all unfolded had been locked by evening. Cameras removed, the whiteboard wiped clean. No plaque, no photos, no trace. Jamari's name wasn't even mentioned in the internal campus newsletter. But Dunning's legacy? Still intact. Still listed on the university website as holding 3 endowed professorships. No mention of retirement. No indication of change. It was erasure in real time. Victoria called it out on her live stream that night, fury dripping from every word. She named names. She cited timelines. She compared Jamari's treatment to the history of Black innovators, stripped of their credit from Katherine Johnson to Garrett Morgan. She didn't hold back, but the institution didn't flinch. Because erasure at that level doesn't require debate. It just requires silence. Keisha stayed up through the night. Her hands trembled every time she refreshed her feed. The photos, the clips, the thousands of messages calling Jamari a hero. It all felt hollow in the face of an institution, pretending he didn't exist. Even Jamari, finally looking up from his notebook, asked her a question she didn't know how to answer. Did I do something wrong? It crushed her. She reached for him, but he had already turned away, retreating into the quiet space where numbers felt safer than people. The next morning, they were scheduled to fly home. No official send-off. No escort. Just an auto-generated email confirming their departure time. Victoria offered to call in more pressure, bring in legal teams, journalists, publicists, but Keisha said no. Not yet. She wasn't done watching. She wanted to see how far Harvard was willing to go to not say his name. Back at the apartment in Chicago, the silence followed them. The trip that should have ended with celebration had left a crater. Friends came by, family called, people cried on the phone, but Jamari remained detached, numb. He'd performed the impossible, and the world moved on without blinking. But the system hadn't anticipated what came next. Because systems like Harvard's are built on control, and control breeds complacency. What they didn't realize was that someone had been listening, not to the event, to what came after. At 2:13 a.m., an audio file leaked online. It was short, just under 4 minutes, but its impact detonated across the internet like a landmine. It was a private conversation recorded in secret between Professor Dunning and another faculty member. The voice was unmistakably his, and it wasn't calm. It wasn't measured.
It was rage.
In the clip, Dunning lashed out, furious about the embarrassment he'd suffered. He called Jamari a stunt, accused Victoria of orchestrating an academic ambush, claimed the university had sacrificed tradition to appease optics. And then came the final line. He didn't solve the problem, he undermined it. Like a magician with a mirror. And if they let this go public, They'll ruin everything we've built. Silence followed. Then a second voice, unidentified, muttered quietly. Then we bury it.
That was all it took.
Within an hour, the clip hit Twitter. Within 2, it reached national news. By sunrise, Harvard was facing a media firestorm it couldn't control. And Jamari Tolles, whose name they had tried to erase, was suddenly the center of the one thing they feared most. Attention! Overnight, a leaked audio file hit the internet. Dunning's private rant after the event. It started with one line. "No little black boy is going to end my career." Dunning's voice, unmistakably bitter, cracked through the audio, like a match dragged across dry wood. The clip, under 4 minutes, spread faster than any university press release ever could. It wasn't just a scandal, it was a revelation, confirmation of everything Jamari, Keisha, and Victoria already knew, spoken aloud in the purest, ugliest form. By mid-morning, social media had turned. Justice for Jamari trended at #1 within hours. Hashtags multiplied, so did anger. Harvard's silence, once cold and calculated, now looked like complicity. Students began organizing immediately. Protest signs were hand-painted across dorm courtyards. Chalk slogans covered brick paths and statues. Black brilliance matters. You can't silence genius. Say his name. Jamari Tolles. Faculty inboxes flooded. Student government passed a resolution demanding Dunning's removal and a full investigation into how the university handled the entire ordeal. Harvard's administration responded with the same tone it always used. Measured, distant, legalistic. They called the comments deeply troubling, but stopped short of naming consequences. They referred vaguely to ongoing internal reviews and respect for institutional process. They never named Jamari, but it was too late for diplomacy. Victoria Hensley struck the first formal blow. Her foundation filed a federal civil rights complaint against the university, citing not just the erasure of Jamari's contribution, but the broader systemic pattern it exposed: selective acknowledgement, institutional minimization, racially coded exclusion. She made it public. On every platform, her lawyers released a dossier of evidence, screenshots of emails, meeting notes, funding documents showing Dunning's knowledge of the challenge's real purpose. She exposed the paper trail. Harvard couldn't claim ignorance anymore. But it wasn't just the legal action that stung, it was the optics. Because now, the world saw the full arc. A 10-year-old genius solving an unsolvable problem, and the institution's frantic scramble to pretend it never happened. Parents began emailing in. Alumni threatened to withhold donations. A high school in Georgia canceled its Harvard recruiting event. A tech CEO publicly announced he was pulling internship partnerships. The blowback hit from every direction. Still, the university resisted. Dunning wasn't placed on leave. No public discipline. No update to his faculty bio. Instead, the math department's website quietly changed the Challenge archive page to reflect a new line. The collaborative event held in Lecture Hall C was part of a long-standing series on open mathematical inquiry. Collaborative, the same word they kept hiding behind. But the internet wasn't interested in academic euphemisms anymore. Footage from the original lecture, once chopped into short viral clips, was now being reassembled, minute by minute. An independent group of students launched a website titled Harvard Erased Him, compiling a full timeline, archived university documents, and a side-by-side breakdown of Jamari's solution against Dunning's original theorem. What began as whispers turned into walls of protest. Every evening, the campus lit up with students holding silent vigils in front of the math building. They wore all black. Some held candles, others stood with notebooks raised high above their heads, blank pages symbolizing all the minds who never got the chance to be seen. Inside her apartment, in Chicago, Keisha watched the movement swell with both pride and dread. She had hoped the story would end after the solution. That maybe, just once, brilliance would be enough. But now the fight had changed shape. Jamari didn't react to the news. He saw the videos, read the headlines, but his expression remained distant. Victory had turned to chaos, celebration into controversy. He'd broken a barrier, but no one had prepared him for what lived on the other side of it. Keisha worried about him in new ways now. He didn't smile like he used to when solving problems. He didn't stay up late drawing new patterns. He moved quieter, lighter, like someone trying not to trigger alarms. Victoria checked in constantly. She offered private tutors, therapists, legal protections, but Keisha declined most of it. Not out of pride, but out of exhaustion. They were still reeling from what hadn't healed yet. Then came the knock at the door. It wasn't press. It wasn't protesters.
It was federal.
2 agents. Clean suits. Polite tone. They asked for a private conversation. It wasn't about the leaked audio. Not directly. It was about the university's internal communications. Someone had reported possible suppression of evidence, manipulation of event archives, even email deletions that violated educational transparency laws. A federal investigation had been opened. Quietly, but seriously, they weren't just looking at Dunning anymore. They were looking at Harvard. Keisha nodded through the meeting, eyes sharp. But her grip on the kitchen chair tightened. She'd worked her whole life to protect Jamari from systems like this. Unfair schools, profiling cops, hostile teachers. But this was institutional fire, and her son was in the center of it. The agents were professional. They assured her this wasn't an interrogation. They just wanted access to any communications Jamari had received, any documentation about the challenge, the university's behavior, and how it changed afterward. Keisha agreed. Then she did something she hadn't done in days. She called her sister, and by morning, she'd packed their bags. The media didn't know. Victoria didn't know. Harvard certainly didn't know. But the Tolles family was done playing pieces in someone else's narrative. Before sunrise, they slipped out of Chicago quietly, strategically, a one-way ticket to an undisclosed city. A fresh start. No interviews, no appearances, no permission. The world was still talking. But Jamari was gone, and the silence left behind spoke volumes. A federal investigation was quietly opened, but the Tolles family had already left Cambridge. The Tolles' apartment in South Chicago had never been quieter, yet never felt so loud. After their silent departure from the chaos, Keisha tried to return things to normal, or at least something resembling it. The curtains stayed drawn, the television remained off, phones rang until voicemails filled, packages arrived daily, books, letters, gifts from strangers who felt like they knew Jamari now. Some wrote poetry, others sent puzzles and handwritten theories. A math professor in Spain mailed a custom-built algorithmic model titled The Tolles Loop. Jamari barely looked at any of it. He wasn't ungrateful. Just detached. Like someone staring at their own shadow and wondering who it belonged to. The world had crowned him a genius. A warrior. A symbol. But none of it felt like his. Not really. He hadn't asked for the spotlight. He hadn't tried to go viral. He just wanted to solve a problem. Now his name lived in conversations he couldn't control. His face had become a flag waved by people he'd never met, and some who didn't even believe in his humanity. CNN wanted to fly him out. Oprah's team emailed 3 times. A producer from Netflix called offering a documentary series deal, promising a chance to rewrite the Black genius narrative. MIT sent a formal invite to tour their campus. A startup offered him $50,000 for consulting on a predictive AI model. Keisha said no to all of them. Not because she didn't believe in her son, but because she believed in keeping him whole. The world had already pulled too many Black children into its circus of exceptionalism, glorifying them until they burned out or became too political to support. This wasn't about math anymore. It was about ownership, and she wasn't handing her child over. Jamari didn't protest. He didn't even ask who had called. He just kept sketching. Not equations, not proofs. Just quiet, abstract patterns that curved across his notebooks, like language he hadn't fully learned yet. It was beautiful, but it didn't look like joy. Keisha watched him in the dim morning light, and her heart fractured a little more each day. She knew what trauma looked like when it wore silence. Victoria reached out again. She wasn't pushing press this time. She just wanted to offer support. Private therapists, secure learning opportunities, access to international educators who would teach Jamari without bias or cameras. Keisha appreciated it, but her trust was cracked. She said she'd think about it. In the meantime, she focused on rebuilding the little things, making hot cocoa before bed, cooking Jamari's favorite baked mac and cheese, finding him new graphite pencils just the way he liked them. She even convinced him to walk with her to the local park on a Sunday morning when the sidewalks were still quiet. They didn't talk about Harvard, or Dunning, or the whiteboard. They just watched squirrels scatter and sunlight blink through tree branches. It felt almost like peace, until the letter arrived. It wasn't emailed. It wasn't delivered through an agent or corporate courier. It came by regular mail, no return address, just a seal. When Keisha opened it, she expected another scholarship flyer or some form letter dripping with vague congratulations. But this one was different. Inside was a single typed page, centered clean. It was an offer. A full scholarship to a private tech academy, so elite, it wasn't even publicly listed online. A place that trained prodigies behind closed doors, funded by billionaire donors and defense-adjacent industries. No tuition, no housing fees, no media exposure. Jamari would be surrounded by top-level minds, advanced AI labs, quantum computing projects, mentors from NASA, DARPA, and top-tier research firms. The letter promised freedom to explore, to build, to lead. But halfway down the page, Keisha's breath caught. There was a clause, a non-negotiable condition. Jamari's work, every algorithm, every project, every idea would be privately owned by the Academy for the duration of his time there. Any breakthroughs, discoveries, models he produced, even unintentionally, would be legally proprietary. He could use the tools, but he wouldn't own anything he made until he was 18. Keisha reread it, twice. It wasn't education. It was acquisition. She handed the letter to Jamari in silence. He read it. Didn't react, but a long, heavy quiet sat between them. He understood what it meant. He always had. Every time the world praised him, someone else tried to possess him. He wasn't seen as a child. He was a resource. A patent waiting to be filed. A genius to be captured. Not cultivated. Keisha asked him what he wanted. He said he didn't know, but that night, he didn't sleep. The future was calling, and it sounded like a contract. An anonymous donor offered a full scholarship to an elite tech academy, but with one terrifying condition. Keisha sat at the kitchen table long after Jamari had gone to bed, the offer letter resting under her fingertips like a live wire. She didn't need to reread it again. She had memorized every line. The words weren't complicated, but the consequences wrapped themselves around her ribs like a vice. It wasn't just an elite academy. It wasn't even just the condition. It was where the offer came from. 2 hours after the envelope had arrived, Victoria confirmed it quietly. The scholarship came from a private research entity with indirect ties to DARPA, a shadow arm of advanced tech development that rarely operated in public view. The same program had previously partnered with government agencies to test predictive AI surveillance tools. Their current work was classified, but whispers were clear. Automated threat detection systems, neighborhood scanning grids, algorithmic behavior prediction, weapons of discrimination wrapped in machine learning. And they wanted Jamari. They didn't care that he was 10. They didn't care that he was still recovering from institutional betrayal. They saw data, and potential, and access. Keisha's stomach turned when she learned what the condition truly meant. Jamari would be embedded, not imprisoned, but entangled. Every keystroke he made would be monitored. Every model he built would be tracked, dissected, repurposed. If he created a new way to predict crowd movement, it could be used to disperse protests. If he coded a behavior map, it could be applied to surveillance in black neighborhoods. His genius would become property. His curiosity, commodified, and he would be taught to believe it was a gift. She couldn't sleep, because she'd already seen it. How tools built by brilliant minds were twisted against the very communities that birthed them. Facial recognition software that failed to recognize black faces, but succeeded in triggering false arrests. Predictive policing that targeted zip codes instead of behavior. She'd fought against it on the ground. Now it was creeping into her home through a letterhead wrapped in promises. The next morning, Keisha didn't mention the letter to Jamari, but he saw it in her face. The shift in her breath, the weight in her shoulders, the way she moved through the apartment, like she was underwater. He had read the fine print too. He understood more than she wished he did.
They had 48 hours to respond.
It wasn't a deadline. It was a trap door. Accept and walk into a gilded cage. Decline and risk being labeled ungrateful. The internet already had mixed opinions about him. Some called him a hero, others a puppet. If news broke that he rejected a full scholarship from one of the world's most advanced think tanks, the backlash would be relentless. People would ask who was really making the decisions. They'd question his capacity, his family, his character. It would become another spectacle. Keisha reached out to Victoria again, who connected her with a former student who had briefly worked inside the same program. What he revealed confirmed everything, and made it worse. The institution wasn't looking for problem solvers. They were looking for pattern readers. And not for education, but for control. They had a long history of recruiting young minds from marginalized communities and framing it as outreach. But once inside, those students were pressured into projects they didn't fully understand, then cut off when they asked too many questions. No project names,
No visibility.
just silence. What Shamari created would never carry his name. He would be hidden inside the system that erased kids like him on the outside. Keisha spent that night pacing. She didn't know how to guide her son through this. Because the truth was, he wanted to go. Not to be famous, not to be powerful, but to learn, to build, to escape the noise.
The academy promised space, quiet, tools. They promised a world where he wouldn't have to perform, where he could just exist in his element.
But the price wasn't just his freedom. It was his soul. She tried to explain it to him without saying too much. He listened, nodded, said he understood. But he didn't speak the rest of the night. She found him hours later, curled up in bed, his tablet screen still lit, showing a blank interface. He wasn't working. He was staring into it, like it might answer something he couldn't ask. The next morning, Keisha woke to stillness. Too still. Jamari's bed was made. His backpack was gone. The front door was locked. But the hallway light was off, and there were no signs of movement. At first she thought he'd gone downstairs, maybe to the mailbox, or to clear his head. Then she noticed the folded piece of paper on the kitchen table. Her name was written in Jamari's clean, precise handwriting. One line beneath it. No greetings, no emotion. Just a single sentence. And a decision she didn't see coming. Jamari vanished the next morning. His mother found only a note. Keisha's heart didn't stop when she saw the note. But something inside her did. A quiet unraveling. A thread pulling loose. The sentence was brief, but it hit like thunder across her chest. There was no anger in Jamari's handwriting. No panic, just resolve. She searched the building, block by block, asked neighbors, called Victoria, checked every train and bus route within reach. Nothing. No one had seen him. But there was something about the way he vanished, thoughtful, quiet, intentional, that told her he wasn't in danger. He was in control. She knew where to look, only after she stopped searching like a mother and started thinking like a boy who had once built a multiplication board out of cardboard scraps in a church basement. The community center. It sat tucked between a laundromat and a corner bodega. Its brick walls faded, its windows fogged with the grime of years. It wasn't fancy, but it was the first place Jamari had ever been called brilliant out loud. He'd gone there when he was 6. A free after-school program for neighborhood kids with nowhere else to go. The center had one broken whiteboard, a jar of dry markers, and a volunteer named Mr. Davis, who used to say, "Sometimes the answer ain't in the numbers, it's in what the numbers are hiding." Jamari had fallen in love with math in that room. And now, that's exactly where Keisha found him. Tucked behind an old folding table, surrounded by a handful of wide-eyed children, all hunched over scrap paper and calculators. Jamari wasn't lecturing. He was listening, guiding, correcting with gentleness, encouraging. The kids didn't recognize him from the news. To them, he was just Jay. When the session ended, Keisha didn't say anything. She just sat beside him on the bench outside and waited. And Jamari, for the first time in weeks, finally exhaled. He didn't need permission anymore. He didn't want contracts or cameras. He wanted to teach. Within a week, he returned to the community center every afternoon. Word spread quietly, organically. A few more kids showed up, then more. Keisha took time off work to help. She brought juice boxes, cleaned chalkboards, and took notes on lesson plans. Jamari wrote in the early mornings. Then, without warning, something shifted. A math teacher from the east side showed up with his niece. Then a youth pastor from across town. Then a group of homeschool parents. And suddenly Jamari's informal tutoring program had tripled in size. He created a system to manage it. Color-coded levels, printable modules, hand-drawn tutorials. But the real shift came when one of the older students recorded him solving a problem with a method no one had seen before. The video was uploaded anonymously. The handle read, "A Blackboard Genius." It went viral within days. But this time Jamari wasn't in the frame. Only the board. Only the math. No face. No name. Just brilliance in motion. Detached from identity, yet deeply rooted in purpose. Comments poured in. Not just praise, but questions. Educators wanted to know the method. Parents asked for the curriculum. A school in Detroit began printing his modules and distributing them in classrooms. A teacher in Oakland used them in a Saturday STEM boot camp. An education nonprofit in Mississippi began reworking its entire math approach based on Jamari's pacing guide. He didn't brand it. He didn't charge for it. He just uploaded, day by day, video by video, anonymous, unbothered, uncensored. Victoria eventually traced the account back to him, but didn't reveal it. She respected the silence. She understood this wasn't a rebrand. It was a rebellion. No university could erase what he was building now. No donor could claim it. No institution could twist it into a marketing asset. Because it wasn't about recognition anymore. It was about restoration. Jamari had watched how the system tried to erase him, then tried to own him. He knew what happened to Black brilliance when it refused to conform, but instead of running from that truth, he leaned into it. He created lessons for children who'd been called disruptive. Modules for students labeled slow just because they learn differently. He created entry points, not barriers. Math became a language anyone could speak, not a code locked behind privilege. And slowly, without press, without push, a movement began to form. The Blackboard Genius Project wasn't about a boy who went viral. It was about what happens when brilliance grows in places the world refuses to water. Within 6 months, school districts from 4 states had adopted parts of the curriculum. Still, no one knew who was behind it. The mystery became part of the magic. Even when journalists tried to trace the voice, or metadata, they ran into dead ends. Some speculated it was a group. Others believed it was AI-generated content. No one could imagine it was a 10-year-old child, operating from a folding table behind a foggy window in South Chicago. Keisha watched it all unfold with quiet pride. She never said no when Jamari stayed late. She never questioned him when he asked for more notebooks, or started sleeping with his tablet beside him again. He was healing. Not because the world gave him space, but because he took it back. Still, the past had not disappeared. Dunning had quietly retired. Harvard released a belated statement, acknowledging Jamari's contribution, carefully worded and equally forgettable. The federal investigation stalled.
No charges.
No reforms, just bureaucracy. But the world didn't care about their silence anymore, because the math was speaking louder. The truth was on whiteboards across the country now, scrawled in Jamari's unmistakable symmetry. And just when it seemed like the story had finally settled, a new video surfaced. Same anonymous style, same soft chalk strokes. But this time the board showed a new hand. Smaller, shaky, younger. A girl no older than 9. Her voice asked a question. The same question Dunning had written years ago. Jamari's original challenge. And then, slowly, she began to solve it. Step by step. Guided. Prepared. Fearless. The caption read, Lesson 1. Let's rewrite the rules. One of his students would soon face the same challenge, and this time the world would already be watching. If you've ever been told you don't belong, if you've ever watched brilliance get buried, just because it didn't come in the right color, then you already know what Jamari felt. No child should have to outsmart racism just to be seen. Type yes if you believe genius has no color. Subscribe if this story broke your heart and opened your eyes.